Hello, everyone. As a director of the Institut Droit et Santé, which is organizing this Entretien Droit et Santé, I am delighted to welcome Mr. Javier Oliva. Thank you most sincerely, Mr. Oliva, for accepting our invitation. Sorry. Mr. Oliva has been a law professor for several years at the University of Manchester and became head of the School of Law in 1993. Mr. Oliva is a lecturer in Spanish law at the University of Oxford and a teaching fellow at University College London. So then I could try to speak you in Spanish, but I think it will worse than my bad English. So I continue in English. Mr. Oliva, you are also the membership secretary of the UK Constitutional Law Association, and finally, the book reviewer editor of Law and Justice. In view of all these qualities, we are truly honored to welcome you here today. Furthermore, I am very pleased that this event is being organized in partnership with the Maurice Hauriou Research Centre. Therefore, I would like to thank my colleague Sarah Cassella, who is a full professor of public law in this university. Thank you for initiating this event and for suggesting that we organize it together. I hope that this event will be the start of a long and fruitful collaboration between our two research centers. Finally, I'd like to thank you everyone in the room and online for following us today at an unusual time. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Sarah Cassella, to introduce the theme of this meeting and take the lead. Thank you once again, Sarah and Mr. Oliva.
Yeah, just to show, I think the mic is off. Because it's written that the mic is off.
Là, c'est normal. C'est ici, que le micro soit fermé, c'est normal. C'est ici. C'est ici. Yes.
So, do people hear us online?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, just really few words. I'm not the important speaker today, but I would also thank very much Lydia for accepting to host this lecture today, which I think is perfectly fitted for the Institute of Law and Health. And so I'm very, very happy to also of this partnership. And I obviously really thank Javier Oliva to have accepted to give this lecture that he already gave in Harvard this year. And he invited here to teach comparative constitutional law, but he also accepted to come here today to give the lecture. So I think we are lucky about that. And I met Professor Oliva some years ago in Brazil. We, at that time already, were speaking about human rights, but now it will be focused on a very specific issue that, as you may know, is very, very important and very sensitive for also universities and researchers that have to make research on human bodies. And obviously, and maybe you remember some years ago, there had been an exhibition about bodies. And already at that time, the question was posed to know what was the legal status of bodies, what you could do with bodies, if there were problems of dignity about the bodies. So I guess that these issues will be at the center of your lecture today. So I have the pleasure to give you the floor, Javier.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and it gives me great pleasure to be with all of you today, and really humbled by this invitation. Extremely grateful to Professor Lydia Morlet and to Professor Sarah Cassella. It's a great honor. We've known each other now for a number of years. We had the pleasure to meet up, lucky us, poor us, in Brazil, an absolutely fantastic conference, and there were lots of projects, and then we haven't implemented half of them, but there is still plenty of time to do lots of things and collaborating with each other. Lydia, I'm very, very grateful to you for this invitation. I think I should probably say a few things before we start our presentation, because I think it's important that, as you will see, the structure I'm going to follow is this one. I'm going to look at the parameters of our discussion, what I'm intending to look at and cover and deal with in the course of the next few minutes. But obviously I live in the United Kingdom, but the UK is a plurinational state. Then we have different legal systems within the UK. And I am not going to focus on Scotland or Northern Ireland because it would be far too ambitious. Then I'm going to be looking at the reality in England and Wales, which are the two nations where I have had the pleasure to live in the course of the last 24 years of my life. I started in Wales, I was there until 2010, and I've moved to Manchester in 2011. I feel, obviously, you always have this sort of imposter syndrome when you go to places like a Faculty of Medicine and so on, because I'm an academic lawyer and I am not a medical lawyer. I have colleagues of mine who deal with this particular branch of law, which is fascinating, but I have approached the area of human remains from a very different perspective, as Sarah was alluding to. Then, as you will see, I'm going to be, the reason why I became absolutely fascinated with this area is because I have an interest in jurisdictions and conflicts of law amongst different jurisdictions. And then I'm going to be looking at what happens in Mount Everest, because this is a no-man land, and there is this whole discussion about what sort of response we should give. And I became fascinated by a very, very interesting figure that you may have come across in the past, whose name is George Mallory, who was a climber and who passed away trying to reach the Everest in 1924. And then I combined my passion for, because I'm quite interested in hill walking and climbing and so on, with my passion in law. I always say that whatever we do in life, law, medicine, anything, we have to do something else, because otherwise life is a bit sad. Then I think it's quite important, therefore, to explain to you how I reached this point because I became fascinated by the way George Mallory body was dealt with, and this has triggered a lot of interest, and I have started carrying out all this research on human remains in the course of the last few years. But my presentation is going to be mainly about historic human remains, and I will explain the difference in terms of legal treatment. But obviously, I'm also very, very interested in contemporary stuff, and I will be very, obviously, bearing in mind what happened here in your institution a few years ago. I think is very pertinent, very relevant, and I would love to hear from you about these matters. I'm going to say that I am not going to display any images of human remains. And with this, I would like to stress very clearly that I'm not taking any side in this debate, because I know there is a diversity of opinions about the appropriateness of showing human remains, with many people really in different sides of this very, very wide spectrum. But I thought it would be a distraction, therefore I have decided not to do it. But once again, this is not any sort of a statement about my position in this particular discussion. And I'm approaching the whole issue of human remains very much as a constitutional lawyer with a passion about constitutions, a passion about the law. And law is obviously an interdisciplinary subject. We need to cooperate with other social sciences, but I think it's brilliant that you have this collaboration with medicine and other. It's absolutely vital that we are not in our ivory tower just looking at, and I think what I'm going to share with you today is probably useful for those of you who don't have a legal background, and hopefully also for those of you who do. Then the parameters will be as follows. I think the cutting point in British law or in England and Wales, I should probably stress, is the whole notion of ancient human remains, because remains that are more than 100 years old would be regarded as ancient, and they will receive a different treatment. But remains of bodies with less or fewer, I should say, than 100 years old fall under the remit of a new piece of legislation. Well, in the United Kingdom, we have very old pieces of legislation. Then something from 2004. I know in continental Europe it's not very new, but here is new enough. Then Time Span Reflects Parameters of Human Tissue Act in 2004. And that piece of legislation is dealing with human remains with less than or fewer than 100 years. I think the reason being for this distinction, and it's a distinction which I wholeheartedly concur, is because we consider that 100 years is obviously a sufficient wide period in order to protect those who have living memory of those people who died. So, oh yeah. Then I should also say that I'm going to be looking at human remains.
I just to cut you because we don't see all the picture. So I stopped the chair and I try again.
Okay.
We have a problem. Wait, I don't understand.
Here, yes, but not online.
Yes,
right?
I don't understand.
Oh, sorry about it, those of you who are online.
Oui, c'est bizarre. C'est bon, c'est celui-là. C'était ça. C'est ça, là.
Ah.
Peut-être on va essayer avec celui-ci.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Ah, là, c'est mieux.
Okay, now that's fine. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
Merci.
Thank you, Lydia. And I should say that there is another fascinating issue. It's about the whole way we treat human remains of indigenous or colonized people taken without operative consent and kept or displayed in museums. I am not going to underestimate for 1 second the significance of this area, but again, this is not what I have been looking at. I mean, there are very interesting questions about colonialism, and I will be alluding to that later today, but my main focus is going to, to refer to the situation of what I would describe as, and this is a very broad term, and I do apologize because but I think it's probably the most accurate, like British bodies. And then I'm not going to get into the whole issue of Anglo-Saxon, Celts, because there is a lot of discussion about all these historical terms. Then I'm going to be looking at the reality of remains of individuals who died in England and Wales and were dealt with post-mortem according to the customs of the communities surrounding them when they died. That is going to be my main focus. Because I think this raises very important issues, because obviously you were referring to the outrage that followed those events here in your institution. And I think this is very, very important because from a legal perspective, I think we really need to ask ourselves, and this is very, very important, is who are the stakeholders in deciding what should happen to these remains and how should they be treated? And I think this is the whole issue about dignity, how we deal with human remains. And then there is the whole issue about how they can be displayed, if they should be displayed, because this is controversial. Then it is very, very interesting. Who are the stakeholders in the United Kingdom about these ancient human remains? Because in the United Kingdom, we have very important groups of pagans who have claimed to be there for centuries, who claim to be the original religion of the British Isles. And they obviously are very proud of the fact that they are prior to any sort of recognition of Christianity in what is nowadays the United Kingdom. They claim that when human remains are found of individuals, obviously ancient human remains, that can be from many centuries ago, they claim that they should be consulted about their treatment and they should have a say about what happens to those remains. And we are talking about pagans. I mean, it's very interesting because I come from southern Spain and I have obviously had this prejudice about what a pagan was probably. I didn't really, I think the UK has, for all its faults, but it's opened up so many things in my life and it's made me far more open-minded and forward-thinking in many ways, because I would have associated paganism with something quite weird and strange and obscure, and it's far from it. And I have pagan friends now in the UK. I would never confide in them what I have just told you, but it's very true that we have this sort of prejudice. And I think, but the reality is paganism is a very strong faith in British soil at the moment, in 2025. And then they would claim that they should have a say about how human remains are treated, how even if they should be displayed. And frequently they oppose the display of such remains. And this assertion of the fact that they deserve it, they have to be given this recognition because they have a greater connection with those remains, is strongly opposed by many historians and archaeologists, but nevertheless is sincerely held. And I wonder, what are the implications for Articles 8 and 9 of the European Convention of Human Rights via the Human Rights Act? I don't want to become too legal here because it would be probably quite tedious, but I would like to remind you that Article 8 refers to the right to privacy and family life, and Article 9, religious freedom, or freedom of religion and belief. Then I think could this sort of claim before a court be held that obviously this is part of the right to family life because of your ancestors and so on? I think this is a really fascinating area. But we are seeing lots of debates about whether or not human remains should be displayed at all. And I would be very happy, obviously, to have that discussion with you at the end of my presentation. Some observers argue that display of human remains is not inherently disrespectful. Why should permitting members of the public to view remains should be seen as less caring or honorable than keeping them in storage? There is a body which is displayed in a museum in London that was found in Lindo. Is an area in England, and this body was probably from the 1st or the 2nd century of our era. And he was probably murdered. And there is the whole debate about whether or not it's disrespectful to show him. Some people would say, well, we shouldn't be showing him, probably, but this person must have really died in really terrible conditions, and it must have received and must have lived a horrible life during his existence. And some other commentators would argue, well, we are honoring him. We are somehow making up for all the errors that we committed as the human race. This is quite a philosophical, but I think it's very important because we all human beings have to be concerned about these matters. Then I do also wonder, does hiding something render it more taboo and encourage fear or sensationalism? Then I think the whole issue about how we deal with human bodies and dead bodies is obviously extremely important. But I think the reality is that we have become such a pluralistic society. And I think the same is definitely applicable to France or Spain or Italy, any other country in our continent, or elsewhere. I think purely homogeneous societies no longer probably exist. But the UK is a real example of diversity. It's a very multicultural society. And I can assure you that there is no consensus about the norms in terms of appropriate treatment of the dead. It will be very difficult to draft and implement either hard law in the form of new legislation or soft law, which would be like advisory rather than legally binding in respect of official guidance. Then we have to face the reality of the lack of consensus about how we deal with questions of life and death that has become very apparent in the social discussion that we have had in the last few years about assisted dying and many other. I think the lack of consensus in British society, currently we have a bill before Parliament and is very likely to become an act, and there will be a recognition of assisted dying in the UK for the first time. It was approved in Spain a few years ago now. But this probably explains why the core legal framework that we currently have in place is almost 200 years old, because we don't really find an agreement, a way forward to bring together society, and there are all these very, very starkly divisive views about how we should be treating those people who have departed. Then I would like to tell you, therefore, a little bit about how the system works in the UK, particularly focusing on England and Wales. That was probably the article that you came across. That was, apart from the fact that I had the honor to deliver it in Harvard University last year, but it was the whole issue about how the system deals with burials of body in the UK, and how do you deal with exhuming or digging up ancient human bodies. I think this is very interesting because the Burial Act 1857 makes a very important distinction, which we haven't changed after all these years. And I do honestly wonder, and I want to learn your views about it, whether or not this makes sense. Sometimes, as much as I love the UK with all my heart, Sarah, sometimes I do wonder, it's tradition, yeah, but we can maintain some tradition if they are opposed to equality and dignity. And then this is the system, okay? The system is as follows. Then you have different rules depending on whether the human remains are found or buried in Anglican ground or elsewhere. Then exhumations outside of Anglican burial grounds require a license from the Secretary of State. In practice, the Ministry of Justice. Well, I'm going to be very simplistic here because we don't have much time, and it's probably a bit more nuanced than this, but I think for the sake of this discussion, I would say this is a rather permissive model in which exhumations are usually, within reason, granted, okay? Therefore, if you want to have the exhumation of an ancestor of yours and that person was buried in municipal cemeteries, exhuming that body, digging up is not the, but is the right term, more colloquial probably than exhuming the body, is appropriate, okay? However, when it comes to Anglican exhumations, we need to follow a very, very rigorous procedure that is set out by the Church of England. Then I know in France, when clear separation between public authorities and religious bodies, I'm coming here to tell you this, it's still a bit crazy, yeah, and people say it's just symbolic, because I have studied Anglicanism throughout my life, and people say, oh, it's just symbolic, it's the king is the governor of the church, or the head of the church, and that's all. No, it's much more than that, and I'm giving you a very clear example of how different the treatment is between Anglicanism and others. Then, if you are buried, if those remains are buried in an Anglican place, you will need to grant or to be provided with a faculty authorization that will be operated by the dioceses. But to make it, and the system is far more restrictive. Therefore, there have been many individuals who have wanted to exhume the remains of ancestors of theirs who by chance happen to be buried in grounds of the Church of England, and they fail over and over again when they tried it, because the Church of England takes a stance that once you are dead and obviously the body is just there and you shouldn't worry about it because you have gone somewhere else. Therefore, it's completely, theologically, it's very sound, and not criticizing then they don't really understand. Basically what they're saying is, why all this fuss about this body when obviously you are already somewhere else? Then they are usually very, very opposed to exhumations in Anglican grounds. But to make it even, and if you're interested, I can share this article with you after this presentation. There is a special legal system for bodies which are known as royal peculiars. I assume many of you, if not all, you have been to London. Have you been to Westminster Abbey? Yeah, that's a royal peculiar. Then it's fascinating because the royal peculiar is linking the church and the monarchy. And in order to exhume bodies buried within the grounds of royal peculiars, you will also need, I know it's very, people say, no, the monarch doesn't have any powers. No, it does. We will need the consent of the monarch. Then we have a whole debate about the so-called princes in the tower. They're buried in Westminster Abbey. If you're interested in those matters, I don't think you need to be an academic lawyer. I think I have an interest because I think it's fascinating. Just read about it in my article or elsewhere because it's really fascinating. The Queen, the late Queen, Elizabeth II, she always opposed it because she didn't really want, she thought exhuming those bodies would be very disturbing. They were just poor children and so on. And it's the whole issue about 2 children who are buried and they claim to be buried to have been killed by an impostor who was challenging the king. And then all that has been really following throughout the centuries. Then what I'm claiming is here that within the Church of, we have, in the UK, we have a system in which you have municipal cemeteries with a very permissive system. And then you have the Church of England treatment, which is quite restrictive, but also within the Church of England system, you have some exceptions that are the royal peculiars. And you even need the authorization of the monarchy. Well, if we are in a society in which citizens have to be treated equally, I'm very sorry to say this doesn't really, this cannot be maintained. Then as a consequence of this twin track system, the fact is that some sites, burials of key historical importance are within the control of the church rather than state authorities. And this is a question I have posed to you in the course of the last few minutes. Is this a rational way to deal with the collective cultural patrimony of the nation? I'm not sure. Some of these burials are pre-Reformation or even pre-Christians. How meaningful is really the connection between the deceased and the denomination that now is controlling the treatment of those remains? I don't think this is fit for purpose at all. As you have seen, I became very passionate about it, but I think it's a really bad. And I could tell you lots of beautiful things about the UK. I love it, but there are lots of very bad things, and this is bad. Okay, and then this brings me to the whole issue about these matters are universal. Then what I'm telling you, the whole discussion you had here in France, in your university, those conversations are held elsewhere. These are universal. The lack of consensus about how we deal with human remains is not just an English or a Welsh thing. It's universal. And I became very interested in these matters, as I told you earlier, because I've been looking at the whole issue of jurisdictions, conflicts between different states. I am particularly interested in the position of sub-state entities within member states. Then the last, I had this book published recently about the position of Quebec in France, in Canada. I think I slept only 3 hours. The position of Scotland in the UK and Catalonia in Spain. Then I'm very interested in these situations of areas where we don't really know at times what is the applicable legal framework. Then this was clearly illustrated with the situation of the Mount Everest. And I wanted to tell you about the treatment of George Mallory, because I think it provides a very illuminating case study. Had any of you ever come across or heard of this climber? I mean, in Britain, he's very, I mean, is there any of you, I mean, you have about, do you have an interest, a particular interest in climbing?
No, I'm favorite hikes, but it's just I've heard about many stories and women that are in the zone of the Mount Everest.
Yeah.
Cannot be brought back because it's difficult access.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Then thank you very, very much. What's your name?
Sarah.
Sarah, that's absolutely lovely. Then in 1999, the body of George Mallory is very close to our heart in Manchester because he was local. He was from an area near Manchester. And you know, when you go to another country and you live in that country, I become very passionate about Manchester. And I'm Mancunian now with this Spanish accent. It's a bit contradictory, but that's... Then in 1999, the body of George Mallory was located on Mount Everest by an American team led by Eric Simonson. Then they took all his personal possessions, the watch from his wrist, the papers in his pocket. They photographed the body, sent images to the press without warning his surviving daughter or other relatives. This happened in 1924, therefore 1999. And this is why I think the lifetime span is so important, because we were talking about like 75 years later. Well, this was absolutely horrendous for the daughter of George Mallory, who had to see how the remains of her father were treated so badly. Then images of Mallory's bodies featured in TV news coverage and in the press, and critically, no consent from his family had been given or even sought. In addition to this distress, there were questions as to whether avoidable damage was done to his body and vital historical evidence had been lost. And it's a horror story. I don't want to dwell too much on it. His clothes were ripped in an effort to find photographs. Any mineral specimens collected would have been scattered in the process. And look at the way these individuals approach George Mallory, who is a hero anyway for those, for so many people. One of the team described finding his body like discovering a Spanish galleon, then demonstrating that they regarded it just as a treasure hunting. Then all these questions obviously gave rise to issues about, is that how we as a society can be dealing with human remains? This is not right. And the issue was that when the leader of the expedition was questioning about the legal status of their action, he claimed, he believed that the law finders applied there on the slope of the Everest. As Sarah was saying, was this claim plausible? No. Mallory's body was in Tibet. That's Chinese. I know that's all a different matter altogether with international lawyers, but then that's, in principle, Chinese criminal law should have been applied and property law would have been applied. Then I just find it really interesting because there is the whole issue about, well, there are areas, and the law of the sea, obviously, you as an international lawyer know much more than me about this matter, but there are areas that obviously there is this discussion about under which the jurisdictions they find themselves, but I think it is quite clear that in this particular context, that was Chinese territory. But what is the point of having a legal order if we cannot really enforce it? And it seems to be the case, however, that because, as you know, the Mount Everest is, part of it is in China and part of it is in Nepal, and that the area which is controlled by the Chinese authorities, the enforcement of the law, as we can imagine, is much clearer in that part. Then, and what about other bodies on Mount Everest? I'm conscious that we don't have much time left, and I'm going to skip through quite a few things there. But there have been other more recent bodies there, like Sleeping Beauty, Green Boots. These are people who died either trying to reach the summit or on their way back, and it's just heartbreaking, and there have been lots of issues about how these bodies have been dealt with. But there have been other contexts, and I just would like to refer to this because it illustrates very powerfully what I was mentioning earlier. What about other settings that are in principle, and this is quite important, inaccessible or outside of the ordinary jurisdiction of states? Shipwrecks of a particular historical significance. Maybe Sarah or anybody else, you've come across the whole issue with the Erebus and the Terror ships. These two ships tried to, obviously, they were seeking the Northwest Passage, and they were, as we can see, they were led by John Franklin, and that was in the 19th century. It was a very, very risky attempt. Then they disappeared. We never heard of them again, but there was always this speculation that they were very close to the Canadian coast. For many, many years, there has been obviously all this speculation, and that gave rise to some legal instruments, which I'm going to refer to in a second. But shipwrecks are clearly of significant importance. And because there was some clear and strong evidence that eventually those bodies could be found, there was a preliminary agreement between the United Kingdom and Canada, including also the Nunavut land claims, playing a very important role with special provisions about repatriation of human remains if the remains of the two ships had been found. Then the agreement was signed in the beginning of this century, even before the ships were found. This is very interesting because obviously there was this search, and both governments, Canada and the United Kingdom, wanted to have a legal framework. And it's fascinating that most of the properties and so on, according to that treaty, would go to Canada, but the British government, to their credit, I have to say, was adamant that if human remains were found, they would have to be repatriated to British soil. And this is really, really interesting. It was considered as very important, and it was incorporated into agreements between states and people even before the ships had been located. And this gives rise to lots of questions, and this is almost bringing me to the end of my presentation. But I think there are also, in this context about colonialization and so on, is it appropriate, would you say, for Western societies to demand the repatriation of bodies of individuals who died in colonized territory? Is that really appropriate? Is that really suitable? Does the duty that the states have to citizens mean that they should negotiate for the return of individuals who, at a personal level, were not responsible for systemic injustices? Does the age of human remains matter? Is this idea that you are going to be distraught, as it happens with poor Claire, just because obviously she had memories of her father and she was a little child when George Mallory disappeared? Or this idea of distraught feelings should also be protected in relation to ancient human remains, about people who were our ancestors and whom we didn't have the opportunity to know. Because the case with Claire was obviously very, very different. Then this raises very, very important questions. At what point should there be a cutoff? Should the wishes and feelings of any identifiable relatives be taken into account? This brings me to the end of my presentation. And in this presentation, I think at pains to stress that as an academic lawyer with an interest in human remains, I am particularly interested in how the law of the land deals with these matters in England and Wales. Then the main reason why, or is twofold. The reasons why I approach these realities on the one hand, because of my interest in contested places, but also because of my interest in constitutional law and religion. Then I'm very, very critical of the legal framework concerning burials, as you have seen, because I think the differences between municipal cemeteries and Anglican burial grounds is really not justified in 2025. But these are my niche areas, but at the end of the day, with all of you, those of you who come from either a legal background or a medical background, I think there are much more fundamental questions that really matter to all of us here. And you don't need to be an academic lawyer for that, which is how, as a society, we deal with human bodies. How can we or should we display them or not? What is exactly the role of museums in these endeavors? Other important questions. What happens, obviously, with the whole issue? Can we, Western countries, now impose, in that sense, our moral values upon other societies and request the necessary repatriation of bodies? These are really, really important matters that bring me to the final point, which is the whole issue of human dignity. And it seems to me that even though there is no consensus whatsoever in our society about how we deal with these matters, and there was probably that consensus more clearly, at least in the UK, over 100 years ago, when we had a very strong presence of the Church of England in British society, where religious dissent was not acceptable. Nowadays, in a society like the UK, in which only 45% of individuals in England declare themselves as Christians, and the second largest group is those people who profess no faith, atheists, agnostics, or unconcerned, obviously, that consensus that we had as a society, fascinatingly, has gone. But we, as a society, it's our duty. And I think we academic lawyers have a duty because we can provide something, which is the legal instruments, but this is not really a task only for us. I think medicine, sociology, so many other areas have a say about how we deal with our human remains. And if anything, I think all these horrible stories that I have shared with you in the course of the last is not the most cheerful topic. When Sarah told me, would you like to talk about human remains? I have lots of other topics which are less, a bit happier. But anyway, for another day. But I would say that all of us, or the vast majority of us, certainly not the leader of that expedition, he was shocked. He was like, I don't know what I did wrong. And he was like, yes, it was really. But I think there is almost a sort of consensus that one way or another, we need to pay respect to those remains as a society. But how we do it, I think, is the challenge ahead of us. Thank you very much for being so lovely and having me here today.
Thank you so much. There are so many, it was very rich, so many inputs and so many questions you asked us to think about, and I think we need some days or some weeks. But maybe there are already some questions, I don't know, online, but first in the room. So feel free to ask questions if you have them.
And always asking the first question is a tricky bit, because you always feel very inadequate, or should I, or then, but I'm very happy. And they don't have to be questions. I would like to obviously learn from you about how you approach these matters.
And
I would ask questions. Easier for me.
Yeah.
I'm the professor. Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I was wondering, I'm not a specialist of human remains, and I'm an international lawyer, Sarah. And I was wondering if the question you ask is more ethical debate rather than a legal debate? Is it the role of the law to deal with that, or only a question of ethics?
Yeah. In terms of the jurisdictional questions, or the...
Yeah, and also maybe what would be the role of law with all these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't pick your name.
Antida.
Antida?
Yeah.
No, it's important. Yeah, no, thanks for your question. It doesn't work.
I don't have a question. Oh, I don't see one.
Okay. So let's stick with the questions of people here.
Yeah, no, I would say, Antida, that it depends very much on, for those of us who are constitutional lawyers, but I think for those of us who have an interest in law, all of us, I think the relationship between law and ethics is absolutely critical. Therefore, it depends very much, as we know, on the understanding of the rule of law that we may have. If it's just a mere understanding of the rule of law as the principle of legality, then the whole issue of ethics don't come into this discussion. But I do believe in an understanding of the rule of law that comes alongside the recognition of human rights and dignity, and that goes even beyond the formal understanding proposed by Joseph Ras and others. Then I would say that is the duty, it's a tricky one, it's the duty of the legal framework to provide an ethical framework at the same time. But obviously this brings us to the very difficult question about what is exactly the morality of a society, of a given society, either the Republic of France or the United Kingdom or the Kingdom of Spain. But I think the law, do you think the law can shy away from those ethical questions? Can I ask you back?
I don't know. I have to explain my approach, because I'm a specialist of artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow.
And we speak a lot about ethics with AI. And I was wondering if it's really a question of ethics or law. And sometimes I can notice a confusion between ethics and law. We have normative instruments. We are named as ethical principle for artificial intelligence. And in fact, when you look at the provision of this instrument, it's only legal principle. So I think we have, maybe it's a period, I don't know, a confusion between ethics and law. And that's why I was...
No, it's fascinating. But then you think when you read the preamble of any statute, I don't know, I'm not very familiar with French law, but obviously there is a rationale why legislation is approved. Why do we have these measures? Why do we decide to? And then I assume that's the ethics of our society. Therefore, I wouldn't say it's a confusion. I would say that the problem is clearly that as societies evolve, finding consensus about what is morally or ethically sound is becoming increasingly, and you are studying such an important area. I mean, I'm full of envy, but at the same time of admiration, because I think it's a very difficult one. Then I guess it's the whole issue about whether we can really detach the legal system from those ethical debates. I don't think we can.
The problem is consensus, I think. At which point an ethical issue can be debated in the framework of law? And if you don't have consensus, this is very difficult. For example, about dignity and the way you use dignity, there is the way of the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, but you also have in France the Council of State that use dignity in order to give power to the state to intervene in some rights because of public order necessities, for example. And so it's a way of reversing the view you have on human dignity, even when the people that are trying to be protected don't want that and say, no, it's not a problem of my dignity. I want, in France, it's a very famous litigation that all students know, because it was about, it's horrible, throwing dwarfs. There were shows where people threw dwarfs, yeah, and the dwarfs were very happy to being thrown during the shows because it was really interesting as an economic activity, you know. And at one time, the Council of State said, no, it's forbidden. It must be forbidden by the authorities of the state because it's contrary to human dignity. But you see that human dignity was against the will of the own people. And in this case, I think this is where it's very difficult to know if you have enough consensus at one time in the society to say that dignity forbids, for example, a specific action.
Yeah, there are two different issues here. I think consensus, Sarah, is a very, very challenging aim. And then I would say that rather than consensus, what I have claimed in my research is that we need a buy-in on the part of society. I would always say it doesn't really matter how many police authorities we have in our land. If the overwhelming majority of our citizens challenge the authority of the police, there is nothing we could do. The only reason why the system works is because there is a buy-in on the part of the majority of people. Then I would say we will no longer find a consensus in our society. But I think we need to be driven by this idea that at least sufficiently, but I think that happens in everything in life. As head of a school at the moment, if I don't have the buy-in on the part of the majority, obviously I will have disagreements with colleagues and there will be people I will be losing along the way. But if I don't have the support of 70–80% of the people, then my position will become untenable. Then I think it's the same as with the law. There must be a buy-in on the part of the majority of people. But as you very, very accurately say, the concept of dignity sometimes is used by different actors sometimes for very spurious purposes and for completely antagonistic aims. And it's the whole notion of consent, because that's the other issue. Is consent always operative? And then we have all these discussions about to what extent you can consent to a number of practices. In legal terms, you cannot really consent in English law to actual bodily harm. Then the fact that I say to Sarah, you can hit me until I die, that doesn't mean if she does it, she is going to be prosecuted, rightly so. Then I have, you're not going to, no, but it's interesting because some commentators claim, I'm not kidding here, some commentators are claiming that this is pure paternalism on the part of the state interfering in our freedoms. I say, well, I want the state to, because the New Zealanders courts have taken a very different approach and they give a lot of weight to the autonomy of individuals. Then, yeah, I think English law is interfering, is restricting our autonomy, but I think in that sense it's necessary because there are other goods that take priority. What I would say it's another interesting part of the research I'm doing at the moment. I'm part of this big coalition that brings together academics because, amongst other things, one of my interests is exorcism. I can come on another occasion. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a normal academic. I do state sovereignty and so on, but then I have my niche areas. And then exorcism, you know that in many, this is relevant. I'm not going off the tangent. The reason why I was asked to join this coalition is because there is this big group of people bringing together NGOs, academics, politicians to ban conversion therapies. Have you ever, you know what they are? Obviously, those practices in order to make a homosexual person heterosexual.
Or radicalized people? Like,
no, in that case, it's on the grounds of sexual orientation or transgender rights. Then some people claim then because many of these practices take place in the course of exorcism, and I've done research on exorcism, I was asked to join this big coalition. But then I hear all the time, but coming back to the dwarves, oh, but they gave their consent. If this guy is saying that he wants to go through a conversion therapy practice because he wants to be straight, because he doesn't accept himself as a gay man, we should just be giving, and those of us who are in that group, we would say, no, that's not acceptable because that consent is void. Because, and then there's a whole issue, anyway, that's a topic for another area, but is to what extent consent could be operative in our societies. Just because people consent to practices, that doesn't make that those practices lawful. And those of you who come from a medical background, do you have an interest in all this human remains issue? Yeah. And where does your interest lie in?
I did 1 year of medical school before studying law, and it was not long after this scandal. And one of my professors talked about what happened, because his thesis supervisor was one of the main people who was involved. And yeah, so in the basement they used to pray that people with people.
I didn't remember this part.
It's horrible because
that's quite harrowing.
Yeah, people get their consent to be research subjects, but when they're dead, so they did autopsy and stuff like that. However, there were some divergences, and they ended up doing horrible things that people did not agree with, and it was kept under the earth for like a long time, and then it came out. And so when my professor talked about it, he was like, I knew the guy supervising, and he was shocked because that's not something you can imagine for another human being to do.
But at least, but there was social outrage.
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm trying to say in this, those are the ethics of our society, I would say. It's not just that the legal framework is giving a proper response to a situation which is regarded as morally. I mean, we all have very different views about abortion, same-sex marriage, assisted dying, I know. But I think when it comes to these matters, I am hoping there will be an emerging consensus that obviously, yeah, we can play football with people's heads is absolutely not part of a civilized society.
I see about during Halloween in South America, some people preserving the bodies of their families after their death, and they do not
bury
them. And I think it's not necessary to have consensus because, like you said earlier, we have many diversity. You say in Manchester it's a multicultural, but in France it's the same thing for me. And to have a protection to say, oh, this is allowed, this is not allowed, because we think we protect people from themselves, like I think it's a little bit moralistic because we never, not to you, but
no, you could disagree with me. It's very legitimate.
In all societies, we never can be 100 consensus about how we can deal with monuments. And I think maybe the best news is to make different legal framework for different parts of society. It's a little bit like the difference, like you said earlier, between England and Wales or Western.
Yeah.
But
would you say here within French society, you would want to have different sort of sub-jurisdictions within France?
In France,
geographically, you mean?
Yeah, yes. And for example, the people in Paris and people in the south don't think the same things. And even that, I don't know, maybe I have a religion, she does not have a religion, but we all have the same nationality, we're friends. And if my state decides one legal framework, for example, about human remains, and I don't feel concerned by this legal framework, I can feel upset because it's not with my feelings, and like human remains, it's not only bodies, but it's after death, it's maybe for some people spiritual. So it's not about the life so no, I think we need a consensus, or I think.
I think your contribution is fantastic. I thank you for that. I guess there are issues about whether the legal framework can be understood in a vacuum, and it cannot. And I think the legal framework in England and Wales is part of the wider English constitutional culture. And I think in England and in the rest of the UK probably, but particularly in England, there's always been this rejection of the intervention of the state authorities and this, obviously, this emphasis on individuals' autonomy that probably politically came to its highest under Margaret Thatcher's government, this idea that society didn't exist and it was just the individual. That's a bit of an exaggeration of what she said, but I think the message is quite clear. Then I would say that explains why the state is quite permissive. And when it comes to exhuming bodies, takes a very different approach from the Church of England, which is more restrictive. Then I would disagree with this idea of having different areas because it creates the sort of inequalities that I have highlighted in my presentation. I would be very interested in learning your views about what differs or what makes the south of France different from Paris. I think probably that's a conversation for another day, but I guess
I was thinking maybe more than the south of France, in the overseas, for example. And you spoke about colonial issues, etc. In the overseas, there are very, very different habits, and also about bodies and the dead. And for example, in the Caribbean, in the French Caribbean, when you have the 1st November, the Day of the Dead, people go and into cemeteries. I was there, so I went there, and they have parties in the cemetery because the idea.
It's not specifically in the French Caribbean.
No, but my experience is in the French Caribbean.
I have a country where we do that also in the Philippines. We also, during the 1st of November or during the anniversary of the dead or like of the dead person, his death or her death would be celebrated with the person in the cemetery. So every family member would go to the cemetery because we have houses or mausoleums of that person, and we can celebrate their death together. Some mausoleums even have air conditioning inside, and have heating inside to accommodate the families who would visit the dead. And it's the case for the Philippines, for example, because we also have some Chinese influence. So there are Chinese cemeteries specifically for Chinese people, and their cemeteries are quite good as well. They're clean and they're properly maintained. So it's not a specific thing, and we regard the dead as someone who is in our memories in a way, because the Philippines has a very large Christian influence as well because of Spanish colonization. So we regard them as someone who comes more like in this presence where they're there always, so we can celebrate it with them instead of like getting sad for their death.
Yeah, but that was really fascinating for me because that's really not the approach we have here, for example, where you go, you're sad, and in this case, you celebrate by remembering.
It's like Mexico's Dia de la Madre.
It's the same. An exchange with the date, with a lot of alcohol to have a good conversation. You can have. I see that.
So it's difficult to take into account, but the question, for example, in international law is for indigenous people and how you take into account their specific customs, because it's also a question of customary law. And this is in Canada, for example, I think it's a very interesting issue because Canada has to take into account customary law. And for example, in Canadian treaties, investment treaties with foreign states, they have to indicate that foreign investors have to have respect for the burials of indigenous people in Canada, because there are very specific legal status that are customary, mainly customary. So this is a very important issue also in cases where it's really about economic activities or something like that.
But you know, Sarah, customary practices differ, obviously, as you were saying. They're quite stark between different continents and so on, but clearly within Europe, I mean, as a Spaniard moving to the UK, I mean, this is very, very, very different because societal expectations about how we pay tribute to the dead are very different in Spain from what happens in the UK. Therefore, I mean, in Spain, in southern Spain, if a person dies, you don't really need to know that person. If you know the son or the daughter or somebody else, you just go to show your appreciation for their relatives of that. That's unthinkable in English law or in English society. I do remember when I first arrived and there was a colleague of mine who lost her mother. And I just said, okay, when is the funeral? And people were like, oh, did you know that lady? And it would be just very, very, very different, and societal expectations about, and obviously, as you know, in Spain, a funeral takes place the day after. In England, it's like 3 or 4 weeks later. Then there is how we really pay tribute to our deceased differs even within Europe. Therefore, yeah, we shall not have consensus. But I'm not entirely sure whether we should have different frameworks within our borders, because as long as if we aim for, and I'm not saying necessarily uniformity brings equality. At times, different situations require different responses. But what I wanted to illustrate today, that I think some people are in agony in England because they want to exhume the bodies of their ancestors, and they cannot because the Church of England takes a very, very restrictive stance. And then it's just a random distinction. If you happen to be obviously encountering a situation in which your ancestors were in a municipal cemetery, everything is going to be very straightforward. Why? If it was just random, if those people are not buried there just because they were Anglicans, but because those burial grounds have become Anglicans with time, then we have this.
No, there's no rationale.
There's no rationale for it.
No.
Anyway,
I'm sorry.
I could be with you for the rest of the day, but probably you want to do other things.
Over time. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for the audience.